is following this for us. Jim, you've actually flown over those islands on a U.S. surveillance aircraft. What do we know? What's happening now?
Well, we're told that this mission could happen any time now, at any hour. The 12-mile perimeter is internationally recognized as the limit of territorial waters. The U.S. taking this step to convey it does not view these manufactured islands as Chinese territory and therefore considers these waters around them to be international. This the second message the Obama administration has delivered to China this year. In May, we flew on a U.S. surveillance aircraft, a P-8 Poseidon, over these same manufactured islands. A similar message from the U.S. that it does not recognize the airspace over them as Chinese either. And you may remember at the time we received multiple warnings from the ground, the Chinese Navy on the ground. This is what they sounded like in that cockpit.
Foreign military aircraft. This is Chinese Navy. You are approaching our military alert zone. Please immediately.
You can expect that U.S. destroyer to hear a similar warning if it sails within those 12 miles. Remember, the U.S. has accused China of militarizing these islands by building landing strips for military aircraft, ports for Chinese Navy ships, even placing artillery on some of these islands. The construction has stopped, but I'm told that's only because they have completed that construction by now. Well, some people refer to these islands as unsinkable aircraft carriers, and in effect, they have that way to project power, in this case, 600 miles from China's shore.
I remember when you got that exclusive look over those man-made islands. There's another developing story we're following right now. For the first time, we're seeing this new video that came out of that daring U.S. Kurdish commando raid last week. One American soldier, unfortunately, was killed in that raid. We're also now getting indications more of this may be in the works.
That's right. In fact, when I pressed Defense Secretary Ashton Carter about the possibility of U.S. forces on the ground facing more combat in Iraq, he said at the time that we will see more missions like this. And now we have a rare look inside one of them, a dangerous operation by the elite Delta Force. The raid, of course, that unfortunately left Master Sergeant Joshua Wheeler dead, mortally wounded, the first U.S. combat death in Iraq since 2011. This raid, a joint U.S. Kurdish operation, the Kurds, though, meant to do the fighting, the U.S. in a backup role. That is not how it transpired. ISIS held prisoners running for their lives, freed from the terror group in a daring U.S. Kurdish joint raid. New helmet cam video shows the raid in northern Iraq Thursday that led to America's first combat death since 2011. Delta Force special operators alongside Kurdish Cobra commandos, seen here checking hostages for weapons or suicide vests. Inside, an ISIS flag hangs on the wall. Then the pop, pop, pop of gunfire as prisoners, some bloodied, flee the burning compound. Later, after the soldiers and hostages are clear, a U.S. warplane bombs the compound into rubble. ISIS released video, it says, shows the resulting damage. The deadly battle was the first time U.S. forces have directly engaged ISIS fighters on the ground in Iraq. The hostages thought to be in imminent danger of execution after U.S. surveillance showed mass graves had been dug. The freed prisoners now claiming they were set to be executed after morning prayers Thursday, says the Pentagon. 5 helicopters brought in nearly 30 U.S. Special Forces and 40 Kurdish troops. The U.S. forces were not meant to directly join the firefight, but when Kurdish forces were overwhelmed, Delta Force operators entered the walled compound, where Master Sergeant Joshua Wheeler was mortally wounded. Master Sergeant Wheeler's remains returned home Saturday, greeted at Dover Air Force Base by Defense Secretary Ash Carter and Army Chief of Staff Mark Milley. Asked by CNN Friday if U.S. forces were now in combat in Iraq, Secretary Carter said to expect more raids.
We have this capability. It is a great American strength.
There are other capabilities the U.S. has been considering, including placing forward ground controllers with Iraqi forces. They could call in airstrikes from the ground. Also the possibility of moving military advisors that have been training Iraqi forces inside bases in and around Iraq, moving them to be forward deployed with Iraqi forces. Going back to Chief of Staff, or Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, rather, Martin Dempsey, he's mentioned those options a number of times. So far, those are options that the President has not yet exercised.
All right, we'll see what happens. Obviously, on multiple fronts, very disturbing information. Thanks very much. Meanwhile, there's also a new report raising serious troubling questions about the security of undersea cables, which carry much of the world's internet traffic and financial transactions. The New York Times reporting that Russian submarines pose a threat to those vital communications links. Brian Todd has been digging into this report for us. Brian, what are you learning?
Well, we're told by experts tonight that those undersea fiber optic cables, you see them here being placed by a ship in the water, that these cables are very vulnerable. They have hundreds of breaks a year, most of them caused by natural occurrences. But could Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, who's been so antagonistic to his rivals recently, could he and his Navy be posing an increased threat to those cables? The New York Times reports that more than a dozen unnamed Pentagon officials have raised concern that Russian submarines and spy ships like this one are aggressively patrolling near important fiber optic cables which carry the bulk of the world's internet communications. Those cables are a couple of miles down on the ocean floors. There's about 373,000 miles of cable down there running all across the globe, enough to circle the globe at the equator 15 times. According to the New York Times, officials are concerned that if a larger conflict between Russia and the West broke out, a Russian ship could locate an internet cable on the seafloor, could lower a submersible down to it, and either attach a wiretap to eavesdrop on it, or worse, could sever the cable, cutting off a crucial data pipeline. Now, the Times and other newspapers are reporting that a Russian ship called the Yantar, you see a picture of it here in Cuba, that this ship has been spotted cruising in the Atlantic not far from where at least one cable lies. The Yantar, according to those reports, has submersibles which have the capability to cut cables on the ocean floor. But officials we spoke with are downplaying the New York Times report. One U.S. official tells CNN the Russians could tamper with the cables, but the U.S. has not seen a significant increase in Russian activity where the cables are located. There's been no evidence of any actual cutting of the cables as well, Wolf. No evidence of that yet, but this vessel, the Yantar, seen kind of cruising around near where one of the cables lies in the Atlantic, Wolf.
And the Russians are pushing back on this as well, right?
That's right, Wolf. We contacted a spokeswoman at the Russian Foreign Ministry. She says, quote, "As we can see, the media has been constantly whipping up hysteria lately to trying to make Russia look like the aggressor. All those reports," she says, "are not based on facts, but based on assumptions. They give impressions or concerns, but no facts." The Russians pushing back hard on this tonight, Wolf.
Brian Todd, thanks very much. Joining us now is the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, retired General Wesley Clark. General Clark, thanks very much for joining us. How likely is it, in your estimation, that the Russians potentially could tamper with these cables?
Well, I think in the event of a significant conflict, there might be tampering with it, but there would also be interference with satellite communications. There'd be interference with land-based communications in Europe or the Middle East. And it's part of the doctrine of warfare, and what you've seen on the part of Russia under Vladimir Putin is they've been increasingly assertive, trying to restore their capabilities and show people their influence. So if they're going out and mapping cables undersea in case of time of conflict, that's more of the same.
It would be devastating for the U.S. and its allies, but potentially it could be totally devastating for the Russians as well, right?
That's exactly right, because a lot of that internet traffic is broken up in bits. It's sent all over the world, and it's reassembled later. So for any particular message, you're not quite sure which route it might be taking. So it could affect Russia. It certainly would.
Is this just muscle flexing on the part of the Russians? What's going on over here? Because all of this is so reminiscent. You and I well remember the bad old days of the Cold War.
Well, it is reminiscent of the Cold War, but this is part of oceanographic research that all navies do. They want to see what's on the bottom. They're looking for strategic significance. They may be looking for ways to navigate their submarines. They may be looking for hiding places for, let's say, moored mines that are remotely activated in shipping lanes, and they may be looking for undersea cables. So you just don't know. People do this, and other navies do this as well.
General, I want you to stand by. There are other very disturbing developments going on right now. Russia's involved in Syria, potentially in Iraq, and now there's some indication the U.S. may be getting ready to talk to Iran as far as Syria is concerned. Stay with us, General Clark. We have much to discuss.
The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer.